He watched the FIFA World Cup with his wife. They cheered for the same team. They sat on the same couch. They watched the same penalty shootout. When the final whistle blew, one of them collapsed. Doctors rushed to save his life. They thought the nightmare was over. 75 minutes later, his wife's heart began to fail. 2 patients, 1 football match. One died from a blocked artery. The other developed a condition so rare that cardiologists would later publish their story in a medical journal. How could one World Cup match destroy 2 hearts in 2 completely different ways? This is Hidden Pathogens.
This is Hidden Pathogens?
Before that football match, David and Margaret had been married for more than 30 years. Friends often joked that if you invited one of them somewhere, you might as well invite both. They did almost everything together. He was 58 years old, the kind of man who believed every problem had a solution if you stayed calm long enough. He fixed things around the house instead of replacing them. If a neighbor needed help carrying groceries or repairing a fence, he was usually the first person to knock on their door. His wife often joked that he had never really retired. He had simply become everyone else's handyman. She was his complete opposite, warm, talkative, the kind of person who remembered birthdays without needing a calendar. She never watched football because she understood the rules. She watched because he loved it. Over the years, she had learned the names of players she could barely pronounce, celebrated goals she didn't fully understand, and sat through countless matches with a smile simply because those 90 minutes made him happy. Friends said they had become one of those couples who could finish each other's sentences. After decades together, silence between them was never awkward. It was comfortable. On match days, they had their own little tradition. They would prepare snacks before kickoff. He always chose the same seat. She would tease him whenever he started talking to the television, like the players could somehow hear him. He would laugh, then keep talking to the television anyway. It had become part of the ritual. The 2014 FIFA World Cup was no different. The match was tense. Every missed chance made him lean a little farther toward the edge of the couch. Every save made her laugh at how seriously he was taking it. Neither of them knew they were living the last ordinary evening they would ever spend together. By the end of the night, one of them would never stand up from that couch again, and the other would soon discover that grief can do something to the human heart that sounds impossible. It was July 2014. The FIFA World Cup had reached its biggest stage. David had been talking about this match for days. He told Margaret it was the kind of game people would remember for years. She smiled and told him she was only there for the snacks. He laughed. By the end of the night, he said, "You'll be cheering louder than I am." She rolled her eyes. "You say that every tournament." As kickoff approached, they settled into their usual places on the couch. David had a habit whenever he watched football. He leaned forward whenever his team attacked. He stood up during free kicks, and whenever the referee made a decision he didn't like, he argued with the television as if the official could hear him. Margaret found it hilarious. She spent almost as much time watching him as she did watching the match. The game was everything football fans hoped for. Neither team wanted to lose. Every attack raised the tension. Every missed chance made hearts race. 90 minutes weren't enough. Neither was extra time. Everything came down to penalties. The room fell silent. David stopped joking. He couldn't sit still. His hands trembled as each player stepped forward. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. "It's only a game," she whispered. He smiled, but he never took his eyes off the screen. Then came the final penalty. One kick, one save, one devastating loss. David stared at the television in disbelief. The celebration on the screen felt impossibly loud. For a few seconds, he didn't say a word. Then he slowly brought a hand to the center of his chest. At first, Margaret thought he was simply heartbroken that his team had lost. She had no idea. Those would be the last few seconds of normal life they would ever share. The match was over. The television was still showing replays of the winning penalty. Commentators were celebrating one of the biggest moments of the tournament. David wasn't listening anymore. He was rubbing the center of his chest. Margaret looked over. "You okay?" He nodded. "Just give me a minute." She wasn't worried. The match had been stressful. His team had just lost. She assumed he was trying to calm down. Then David took a slow, deep breath. It didn't help. The pressure in his chest was getting worse. Not sharp, not stabbing, just an unbearable weight, as if someone had placed a concrete block on his chest. He stood up from the couch. Almost immediately, he had to sit back down. His face had turned pale. A thin layer of sweat covered his forehead. Margaret's smile disappeared. "David?" He tried to answer. The words came out weak. "My chest." That was all he managed to say. Seconds later, he collapsed onto the living room floor. Margaret screamed. She rushed to his side. "David! David! Can you hear me?" There was no response. She shook him. Nothing. She reached for the phone with trembling hands and called emergency services. The dispatcher asked if he was breathing. Margaret looked down. She couldn't tell. The dispatcher immediately began talking her through CPR. She placed both hands in the center of his chest. 1 compression, 2, 3. She counted through tears, begging him to wake up. Within minutes, paramedics burst through the front door. They attached heart monitors, started oxygen, prepared the defibrillator. Clear. His body jerked. No pulse. Again. Clear. Nothing. The room that had echoed with football commentary just moments earlier was now filled with alarms, shouted commands, and the sound of compressions. Margaret stood frozen in the corner, watching strangers fight for the life of the man she'd spent more than 30 years with. The ambulance rushed him to the hospital. Doctors continued everything modern medicine could offer, but one of the arteries feeding his heart had become critically blocked. The muscle had been starved of oxygen. Its electrical system could no longer maintain a normal rhythm. Despite every attempt to bring him back, David was pronounced dead. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. Less than an hour ago, they had been sitting together on the same couch, arguing over a football match. Now she was being asked to identify her husband's body. She thought the worst night of her life was over. She was wrong. In just 75 minutes, she would become the hospital's next cardiac emergency. Someone handed her a cup of water. Another nurse gently suggested she call her children. She stared at the paper cup in her hands. She couldn't remember picking it up. Everything felt unreal. Just hours earlier, she and David had been laughing at the television. Now his jacket was folded over a chair. His wallet sat inside a plastic evidence bag. His wedding ring had been placed in a small envelope for safekeeping. Every item in front of her belonged to a man who wasn't coming home. A doctor sat beside her. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Margaret nodded. She heard the words, but they didn't seem to mean anything. She kept expecting David to walk through the door and complain that everyone was making too much fuss over him. Instead, a nurse quietly asked if there was another family member they should contact. Margaret opened her mouth to answer. Before she could speak, she felt an odd pressure in her chest. At first, she ignored it. Grief does strange things to people. She assumed it was panic, or exhaustion, or simply the shock of losing the person she'd loved for more than 30 years. She took a slow breath. The pressure didn't go away. It spread into her left shoulder. Her heartbeat suddenly felt wrong, too fast, then too slow. The room began to spin. A nurse noticed her face. Margaret? She looked unusually pale. Beads of sweat appeared across her forehead. The cup slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. "I'm not feeling..." She couldn't finish the sentence. She clutched her chest, the same place David had grabbed less than 2 hours earlier. The nurse immediately pressed the emergency call button. Within seconds, the room filled with doctors. They helped Margaret onto a stretcher. Blood pressure, pulse, oxygen, an electrocardiogram. Everything happened at once. One physician looked at the heart monitor, then looked back at Margaret. "This looks like a heart attack." The words froze everyone in the room. 75 minutes earlier, her husband had died from a catastrophic heart event. Now his wife appeared to be having one too. The doctors had seen families with heart disease before, but two life-threatening cardiac emergencies on the same night, within 75 minutes of each other, it didn't make sense. Was this an extraordinary coincidence? Or had something happened during that football match that had put both of their lives in danger? The answer would force the cardiology team to consider a diagnosis almost no one expected. Here's what happened inside David's body that night. For years, David had no idea that fatty deposits called atherosclerotic plaques were slowly growing inside one of the arteries supplying his heart. They caused no pain, no warning, no symptoms. Each year, the artery became a little narrower. His heart adapted, until the World Cup. As the match became more intense, his brain released enormous amounts of adrenaline. His heart began beating faster. His blood pressure climbed. His heart suddenly needed far more oxygen than usual. Then it happened. One unstable plaque inside his coronary artery cracked open. His immune system mistook the rupture for an injury. Platelets rushed to the area. Within minutes, a blood clot formed. The clot completely blocked the artery. The section of heart muscle beyond the blockage was instantly cut off from oxygen. Heart muscle begins dying within minutes. As more cells died, the heart's electrical system became unstable. Instead of beating in a coordinated rhythm, the muscle began quivering chaotically. Blood stopped reaching his brain. He collapsed. That wasn't because football killed him. It was because football exposed a disease that had been silently growing inside his arteries for years. And then inside Margaret's body, what was happening was seemingly different. Margaret's heart looked completely different. When doctors examined her arteries, they found no blockage, no clot, no plaque rupture. Instead, her brain believed she was experiencing one of the worst moments a human being can survive. It flooded her bloodstream with stress hormones, adrenaline, noradrenaline. In small amounts, those hormones help people survive danger. In overwhelming amounts, they become toxic to the heart. The chemicals stun the left ventricle, the chamber responsible for pumping oxygen-rich blood throughout the body. Instead of squeezing normally, the tip of the ventricle ballooned outward with every heartbeat. Her heart was still alive, but it had become temporarily too weak to pump effectively. That's why she experienced chest pain. That's why her ECG looked like a heart attack. That's why her blood test showed heart muscle injury. But unlike David, her heart wasn't dying. It was temporarily paralyzed by grief. Margaret was rushed into the emergency department. The medical team moved quickly. Blood samples were drawn. An electrocardiogram was repeated. A chest X-ray was ordered. Within minutes, a cardiologist arrived. He looked at the ECG. He frowned. There are changes. The tracing looked frighteningly similar to a heart attack. Margaret's symptoms matched too. Chest pain, shortness of breath, cold sweat. She had all the warning signs. The team prepared for the possibility that one of the arteries supplying her heart was blocked. It wouldn't have been surprising. She had just experienced one of the most devastating moments imaginable. Perhaps the stress had triggered a heart attack. Perhaps she had the same hidden heart disease as her husband. The doctors couldn't afford to guess. Every minute mattered. Blood tests came back. One result caught everyone's attention. Her cardiac enzymes were elevated. That meant heart muscle had been injured. But something still didn't fit. The numbers weren't as high as they expected. Not for someone whose ECG looked this abnormal. One cardiologist leaned closer to the monitor. He had seen hundreds of heart attacks. This looked familiar, but not quite familiar enough. There was another possibility, a rare one. To know for certain, they needed to look directly at the arteries feeding her heart. Margaret was taken for an emergency coronary angiogram. The procedure would answer the biggest question of the night. Was one of her coronary arteries blocked? just like David's? Or was something completely different happening inside her chest? The images appeared on the screen, one artery, then another, then another. The room became strangely quiet. The arteries looked normal. No major blockage, no clot. Nothing that could explain why her heart was behaving as if it had suffered a massive heart attack. The cardiologist stared at the images. If it wasn't a blocked artery, then what had nearly stopped Margaret's heart only 75 minutes after watching her husband die? The answer was so unusual. Most doctors spend their entire careers without seeing it. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. And if you value these videos, there's a free link in the description and pinned comment that helps support the channel. Every bit of click helps us continue researching and telling these stories, and it's completely free. Now, let's continue. The angiogram had ruled out the diagnosis everyone feared. Margaret's coronary arteries were open. There was no blockage, no clot, no reason she should have been experiencing what looked like a massive heart attack. Yet every monitor in the room told a different story. Her heart wasn't working normally. Something had damaged it. The question was, what? The cardiologist ordered one more test, an echocardiogram. Unlike an angiogram, which shows the blood vessels, an echocardiogram shows the heart itself as it beats. The ultrasound probe was placed against Margaret's chest. Seconds later, her heart appeared on the screen. The room fell silent. One of the doctors leaned closer. There it is. The tip of her left ventricle, the heart's main pumping chamber, was barely moving. Instead of squeezing with each heartbeat, it had ballooned outward. The base of the heart continued to contract, but the lower portion had become weak and almost motionless. The shape was unmistakable. It reminded the cardiologist of a traditional Japanese octopus trap, wide at the bottom, narrow at the top. He had seen pictures of it in medical journals. He had read about it during training, but seeing it in real life, especially just 75 minutes after her husband's death, was extraordinary. The cardiologist turned to the rest of the team. "This isn't a heart attack," he paused. "It's Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, also known as broken heart syndrome." The room became quiet again. The name sounded almost poetic, too poetic to be real. But the condition was very real. Margaret hadn't developed a blocked artery like David. Instead, the overwhelming emotional shock of watching her husband collapse, trying to save him, and then being told he had died, had flooded her body with stress hormones. Adrenaline, noradrenaline, chemicals designed to help people survive danger. In extreme amounts, they can temporarily stun the heart muscle. The heart doesn't stop, but it suddenly becomes too weak to pump the way it should. To everyone watching, it looks almost identical to a heart attack. The chest pain, the abnormal ECG, the elevated cardiac enzymes. Even experienced doctors can mistake one for the other. But unlike David, Margaret's arteries weren't blocked. Her heart had been overwhelmed by grief itself. The cardiologist looked around the room. In decades of practice, he had treated countless heart attacks. He had treated patients after accidents, after natural disasters, after devastating phone calls, but two life-threatening cardiac emergencies, a husband dying from a blocked coronary artery, and his wife developing broken heart syndrome just 75 minutes later, was something he had never witnessed before. Years later, the case would be published in a cardiology journal, not because football was dangerous, but because it demonstrated something medicine has learned only recently. Sometimes, a broken heart isn't just a figure of speech. Unlike David, Margaret still had a chance. The cardiology team knew Takotsubo cardiomyopathy could be terrifying. Most patients recover, but not all of them. In the first few hours, the weakened heart can suddenly become unstable. It can trigger dangerous heart rhythms. Blood pressure can crash. Fluid can begin to collect inside the lungs. Some patients die before their heart has a chance to recover. The doctors couldn't assume Margaret would be one of the lucky ones. She was admitted to the cardiac intensive care unit. Every heartbeat was monitored. Every change in her blood pressure was recorded. Nurses checked on her constantly. Doctors repeated echocardiograms to see whether her heart muscle was getting stronger or weaker. Margaret was started on medications to reduce the strain on her heart. Others helped control her blood pressure and lower the effects of the stress hormones still flooding her body. The hardest part, however, was something no medicine could treat. Every time she opened her eyes, she remembered David. She remembered him laughing before kickoff, arguing with the referee through the television, smiling when she teased him, then grabbing his chest, then collapsing. The memories replayed over and over again. Hospital staff tried to comfort her. Her children stayed by her bedside. They took turns holding her hand, telling her she wasn't alone. But grief doesn't disappear because someone tells you to be strong. The heart may be a muscle, loss is not. Over the next few days, the doctors noticed something encouraging. Margaret's chest pain became less frequent. Her breathing became easier. The abnormal patterns on her heart monitor slowly began to settle. A repeat echocardiogram brought the news everyone had been hoping for. The weakened part of her heart had started moving again. Little by little, its strength was returning. That was the strange thing about broken heart syndrome. It can look almost identical to a massive heart attack. It can leave patients critically ill, and then, if they survive those dangerous first days, the heart often heals. Not because the emotional pain is gone, but because the stunned heart muscle gradually recovers. Margaret's body was beginning to mend. Her heart was becoming stronger, but every improvement came with a painful reminder. She was recovering, without the man she'd spent more than 30 years beside. Doctors could repair the damage inside her chest. They couldn't repair the emptiness waiting for her at home. And when she was finally well enough to leave the hospital, she would have to walk through her front door alone for the first time in decades. A week after the World Cup match, Margaret was discharged from the hospital. The doctors were encouraged. Her heart was recovering. The ultrasound showed the left ventricle was slowly returning to its normal shape. The dangerous weakness that had frightened the cardiology team just days earlier was beginning to disappear. She was prescribed medication to help her heart recover. She was told to attend regular follow-up appointments, and for the first time in her life, she was told that emotional stress had nearly killed her. Not stress from work, not financial problems, not months or years of anxiety, just one overwhelming moment, one phone call, one goodbye she never expected to say. The drive home was silent. Her children offered to stay with her. They worried she shouldn't be alone. Margaret agreed. When they opened the front door, everything looked exactly the way they had left it. The television remote was still on the coffee table. The empty snack bowls were still sitting where they had been during the match. David's reading glasses rested on the arm of his favorite chair. His jacket was still hanging by the door. For a moment, it felt as though he might walk in from the kitchen at any second. Instead, there was only silence. Margaret sat down on the same couch where they had watched the match together. She looked at the television. She couldn't bring herself to turn it on. Not that day, not the next day, not for a long time. Over the following weeks, her strength slowly returned. Follow-up scans showed her heart muscle continuing to recover. The chest pain faded. Her breathing became normal again. Physically, she was healing. Emotionally, the recovery was far more complicated. She had survived. David hadn't. People told her how fortunate she was. She smiled politely, but every heartbeat reminded her of the one that had stopped beside her. Years later, cardiologists would continue discussing her case, not because it was the saddest story they had ever heard, but because it demonstrated something medicine still struggles to fully understand. The human heart doesn't respond only to blocked arteries. Sometimes, it responds to overwhelming emotion. And in rare cases, grief alone can make a healthy heart behave as though it has suffered a heart attack. David's heart never recovered. Margaret's eventually did. But neither of them left that World Cup night unchanged. One lost his life. the other lost the person she had planned to spend the rest of it with. When people heard Margaret's story, many asked the same question. Can watching football really kill you? The answer is, not by itself. Millions of people watch the FIFA World Cup. They celebrate, they shout, they cry, and they go to bed completely fine. The match wasn't the real danger. The problem was what the match did inside David's body. Years before that night, plaque had been quietly building inside one of his coronary arteries. He didn't know it was there. It caused no warning signs, no pain, no reason to skip watching the biggest football match of the year. Then came the emotional surge. As the tension built, his body released adrenaline. His heart beat faster. His blood pressure rose. His heart demanded more oxygen than usual. For someone with healthy arteries, that response is usually harmless. For someone with a severely narrowed coronary artery, it can be enough to trigger disaster. The plaque can rupture. A blood clot can form within minutes. Blood flow to the heart muscle can suddenly stop. Without oxygen, the heart's electrical system becomes unstable. Dangerous rhythms can develop. And if those rhythms aren't stopped immediately, the heart can stop beating effectively. That's what happened to David. Margaret's heart told a completely different story. Her arteries were healthy. No clot blocked the blood supply. Instead, the overwhelming shock of losing her husband unleashed an enormous wave of stress hormones. Those chemicals temporarily stunned her heart muscle. It was as if her heart had forgotten how to squeeze. To doctors, it looked almost identical to a heart attack. But the cause was entirely different. One blocked artery, one broken heart, two diagnoses, one unforgettable night. Cases like this are rare, but they have taught doctors an important lesson. The heart is influenced by more than cholesterol, blood pressure, and genetics. Powerful emotions can affect it too. That doesn't mean people should avoid watching sports or stop celebrating the moments they love. It means recognizing that sudden chest pain, shortness of breath, fainting, or unexplained collapse during or after intense emotional events should never be dismissed as just excitement. Minutes matter. Calling emergency services immediately can save a life. Because sometimes, the difference between surviving and becoming a medical case report is how quickly someone realizes that what feels like emotion may actually be a heart in crisis. They watched the FIFA World Cup together. They cheered for the same team. They sat on the same couch. They watched the same penalty shootout. When the final whistle blew, David grabbed his chest. Minutes later, his heart stopped. Doctors discovered a blocked coronary artery had taken his life. Margaret held his hand. She believed the nightmare had ended. 75 minutes later, she became the next cardiac emergency. Her heart wasn't blocked. It wasn't infected. It wasn't poisoned. It was overwhelmed. Doctors called it Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. The world knows it by another name, broken heart syndrome. One football match, two hearts, two completely different diseases. One man died because blood could no longer reach his heart. One woman nearly died because grief changed the way her heart could beat. That was the only difference. Years later, cardiologists published their story, not because the World Cup was dangerous, but because it reminded the medical community that the heart is more than a pump. It responds to blocked arteries. It responds to hormones, and sometimes it responds to heartbreak. The next time you watch a match that has your heart racing, remember David and Margaret. Celebrate the goals, enjoy the moments, but never ignore chest pain, sudden shortness of breath, or an unexplained collapse, because what feels like excitement could be the first sign that your heart is asking for help. And sometimes, listening to it can be the difference between going home after the final whistle or becoming a story doctors never forget. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos, and every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel. Also, it's completely free. If you learned something from this case, like, share, and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, leave a comment and tell me what would make these videos better. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next video. Good night.
This is Hidden Pathogens.